Something Dreadful by Mark Alexander. Read by Colin Baker.
My first day at Mount Pleasant Secondary School turned out to be so dreadful I shall never forget it. Being a new boy and starting in the middle of term, I was taken to my classroom by the head teacher. Here I had to endure 30 pairs of strange eyes staring at me, while I was introduced to Mr. Candy, the form teacher. Then I was shown to an empty desk in the centre of the room. I would rather have had one in a corner at the back. And Mr. Candy carried on with his lesson. As well as being our form teacher, he took us for classical studies and English. A girl sitting nearby gave me a nice smile, as much as to say, "Don't worry, you'll soon get used to us." Her name was Pamela Holt. She had very fair hair, and I looked forward to getting to know her. The other person to take notice of me was a rather tough-looking boy, whose name I soon found out was Maurice Carson. He gave me a wink, and I decided that the class was a friendly one. I had yet to learn what his winks really meant. At break, I was hanging round in a corridor, not knowing what to do with myself, when Maurice came up with half a dozen boys behind him. They were his gang of hangers-on, who always laughed at his jokes and were very careful not to disagree with him. "Whatcha, mate?" he said in a voice that made the others grin. "What school you from, then?" I wished they'd go away, because I had glimpsed Pamela Holt coming down the corridor, but I answered politely, "Well, I haven't been at school for a while." "You been in prison, then?" Maurice demanded. "Better watch out. I reckon we've got a right villain here." His gang roared with mirth. "I haven't been well," I explained, and found myself blushing. "You don't look sick. What's wrong?" "I had a cough." The boys immediately clutched their throats and made horrible choking sounds and thumped each other on the back. Maurice put his face close to mine and gave me another of his winks. "There's something that new kids have to learn," he whispered. "I'm the boss around here, and any new kid has to kiss my boot to show he understands it." I really thought he was joking, so I said, "Don't be silly." His hand grabbed my wrist, and I was suddenly scared that a boy the same size as myself could be so strong. At that moment, Pamela came up and said, "Billy, whatever your name is, don't take any notice of Maurice. He likes playing at being the school bully." He grinned, and then, putting his other hand around my wrist, gave me a Chinese burn. It was so quick and painful that I couldn't stop myself crying out. Pamela turned round, but Maurice had let go of me and stood looking innocent while his gang fell about laughing. She tossed her head and vanished round the corner. "You mustn't mind my fun," said Maurice, suddenly friendly. "Come to the gym after school. You can have a tryout." It was puzzling. Perhaps he wasn't so bad after all, though my wrist still felt as though it was on fire. I was going to ask what he meant by a tryout, but the buzzer sounded for the next period, and the corridor filled with kids stampeding to their classrooms. When it was time to go home, several of Maurice's friends surrounded me. "You're coming for the tryout," they shouted. "Well, is it for a game?" I asked. They nodded and hustled me to the gym, where Maurice was already waiting in sports shorts and boxing gloves. He gave me his usual wink. "Get the gloves on him," he said, and before I could protest, my hands were thrust into heavy boxing gloves. I had thought that the tryout would be for something like the class basketball team, so I said, "Well, I've never done boxing before." "Maurice will soon teach you," said someone with a snigger. Next minute, I was in the centre of the gym floor with Maurice dancing round me as though he had springs on his feet. I put up my left arm, as I had seen boxers do on the television, and then, smack! Maurice's glove caught me full in the face. "He has style," I heard Maurice call to his guffawing mates. "He just hit my fist with his nose." Blood dribbled into my mouth and my eyes watered, and Maurice was on the attack again. I had no idea how to dodge his blows, and he used me as a punch bag. It was a nightmare, with this boy circling me while his arms worked like pistons. I did make an effort to fight back, but I could hardly see for the tears in my eyes, and the thudding of the gloves on my head and ribs stopped me thinking properly. Then a really hard punch caught me full in the mouth, and one of my front teeth broke off. "Give him a chance," I heard a voice say. I spat out my tooth and saw a boy from another class standing at the door of the gym. "You want to take his place, then?" Morris demanded. The boy shrugged and left. One of the gang made a noise like a gong, and there were shouts of, "Round 2, seconds out," and the tryout began again. And as Morris hit me, he winked. Afterwards, I tried to clean myself up in the boys' lavatory. The gang had gone off whooping and laughing, and now in the mirror I saw what a mess I was. One eye was blacked, and my nose and lips were swollen, and there was a gap where my tooth had snapped. I could not stop tears rolling down my face. How I hated Morris. I vowed that some day I would pay him back for this afternoon. When I went home, I pretended that I'd fallen off my bike. Well, I couldn't bring myself to admit that I'd been bullied. I knew that if I did, my mother would complain to the headmaster, making everything worse, while my dad would order me to go and thump Morris. "You've got to stand up for yourself," I could imagine him saying. "You're as big as he is. Go and thump the stuffing out of him." All right for him to talk. He'd been the athletics champion at his school, and no one had ever pushed him around. Next day I went to the dentist to get the root of my broken tooth extracted, and it was mid-morning when I went to the dreaded classroom. "Good heavens!" cried Mr. Candy. "You look as though you would tangle with a bus." "Pascal Morris," said somebody in the back in a loud whisper, and there was a lot of laughing. "Take your seat, and the rest of you be quiet," said the teacher. "Today we are going to consider the gladiatorial games in ancient Rome." With all eyes on my bruised face, I slunk to my seat and saw Pamela shake her head at Morris as though she was angry with him. But he grinned back at her, and she smiled slightly. My life at Mount Pleasant continued to be miserable. Morris saw to that. I realised that he kept up his position as leader of his gang by making someone else, at this time it was me, look small. This amused the others, and also showed what could happen if they stopped toadying to him. Each morning when I left home, I had a sinking feeling as I thought of the day ahead, wondering what trick Morris would play on me. I could almost hear the laughter of the others before I got to the school gate. Sometimes he would give me a crafty punch in the corridor. Sometimes he made a fool of me in class. He moved his seat so that he sat behind me, and when I was answering a question he would dig me with a ruler so I stammered and sounded so stupid that the teacher would turn in disgust to one of the brighter pupils. What hurt the most was when he humiliated me in front of Pamela. One day, before the lesson started, I was cleaning the blackboard in our classroom when Morris came in with his gang. "You sucking up to old Mars bars, coming in cleaning them boards?" he demanded. "No," I said indignantly. "He made me do it because, thanks to you, I couldn't answer that question on the Roman Forum properly." Morris ignored this, but made his usual threat. "The penalty for sucking up to teachers is to kiss my boot," he said. "Come on, teacher's pet, on your knees." At that moment, Pamela and some of her girlfriends came through the door, and for an instant I thought I'd been saved. But at a sign from Morris, one of his mates jerked my arm up my back, and before I realised what was happening, I was forced down. Morris twisted his fingers in my hair and pushed my face towards his dirty trainer. "Oh, stop that, it isn't fair," Pamela cried. "It's an old English custom going back to King Arthur, the order of the boot." "Oh, Morris, you're dreadful," she said, but she couldn't help giggling. The sound of the teacher's footsteps in the corridor sent the gang scuttling to their desks, leaving me kneeling on the floor. "Am I interrupting your prayers?" asked Mr. Candy. "At this moment, I'd rather you concentrated on blackboard cleaning than devotions to Mecca." There was a dutiful ripple of laughter from the class, the loudest coming from Morris. As the term went on, things did get a little better. An Indian family moved into the neighbourhood, and one of the boys had the bad luck to be put in our class. Because his English wasn't good, he made an ideal victim for Morris, who never grew tired of mimicking him. But he did not entirely forget me, and the tricks and secret punches continued, so that I was still far from happy at school, and ashamed of myself, because I did not have the courage to stand up to the bully. Mr. Candy planned to take a party of us who did classical studies to Rome in the summer holidays, but when I heard that Maurice Carson would be going, I did everything I could to get out of it. This made my mother and father very angry with me. "Turning your nose up at a trip to Italy?" said Dad. "Let me tell you, there were no trips to Italy when I was your age." "Oh, there were plenty of other things we could have put the money to, but we thought it would help you to get on with your studies," said Mum. I couldn't explain that it was not the trip I objected to, but one of the boys going on it, so I shrugged and said I was sorry and would go after all. We went to Rome by coach, and on our first morning there, Mr. Candy took us to the Colosseum. It was very hot as we climbed up the stone tiers of the ruined amphitheatre. And while Mr. Candy pointed things out and gave little lectures about them, the kids were only interested in finding a stall which sold cold cokes. At last, we stopped on a platform, which Mr. Candy said was where the emperors sat when the games took place. On a ledge below us was a line of railings, which reminded me of ancient Roman tridents because of their nasty-looking triangular points. I suppose they'd been put there to stop people trying to climb the crumbling masonry. "Keep back from the edge," ordered Mr. Candy. "You could easily slip and fall on those rails. I don't feel like explaining that to anybody's parents." Of course, everyone crowded forward to see them better, and Morris stood on the edge swaying backwards and forwards as he pretended he was about to fall over. "Stop playing the fool, Carson," Mr. Candy said. "We don't want any accidents. Now, from here you can see that the floor on which the gladiators fought is gone. Those walls and passages in the arena are really the cellars, which used to be below the floor where the wild beasts were kept, and where the gladiators waited." "Cool, it's nearly as good as White Hart Lane," Morris said, and as usual, everyone chuckled. "And why do you think the Romans had the Colosseum, Carson?" demanded our teacher. "They ain't got a telly, sir." "For once, you are quite correct. The citizens of Rome had too much leisure because nearly all the work was done by slaves, and so the games were held to keep them amused and occupied. Now, you can go off and explore by yourselves for half an hour, and then we'll meet by the entrance, and no writing graffiti on the walls." "Not even Spurs rule okay?" Morris asked, and giggling, the party split up. I was going down some steps when a foot hooked my ankle and I tumbled headlong. Even here, Morris could not resist tormenting me, and I was filled with hatred for him and his bullying. Feeling bruised and dizzy, I picked myself up and found a place in the shade away from the others. It was a relief to lean against cool stonework and close my eyes, because I was afraid that I was going to faint. When I opened my eyes again, everything had changed. To begin with, the stadium was full of people, tier upon tier of them seeming to rise up to the sky. The floor of the arena was now smooth and covered with the finest, whitest sand I had ever seen. And as I marched across it, I noticed that in the distance some slaves were raking it after the last combat. Although the part of the stadium where the wealthy people sat was shaded by ships' sails, the heat of the sun burned my back, and I realised that I was only wearing sandals and a sort of leather skirt. In my hands, I carried a fishing net and a trident. And looking to one side, I was aware that another gladiator was also walking across the dazzling sand towards the royal box. He was dressed like me, but instead of a trident and net, he carried a sword and shield, while under his arm was tucked a heavy iron helmet. There was something frighteningly familiar about him. And then I realised who he was. We halted and looked up at the Emperor, a small figure in a purple toga surrounded by women in flowing robes and protected by a line of Praetorian guards with red-plumed helmets, who stood at attention behind his box. The roar from the thousands of spectators died away, and in the eerie hush which followed, we held up our weapons and stammered something about, "We who are about to die salute you." Wearily, the Emperor raised his hand. It held a bunch of grapes, and a fanfare of silver trumpets split the silence. Cheers exploded from the crowd, and I could hear the hoarse voices of the bookmakers shouting the odds on trident or sword. Before he put on his heavy helmet, my opponent turned to me. "Get ready to kiss my sandal," he said, and then ran into the centre of the arena. I followed on trembling legs. We took up our positions facing each other. He crouched with his shield held in front of his face and his sword pointed in my direction. I stood with my trident in my left hand and my net, which was weighted with lead pellets, in my right. My role was to try and get my adversary entangled in the net and then spear him. And I knew I would only have one chance to cast the net. Again the trumpet sounded, sending flocks of pigeons circling the Colosseum yet again, and then all was quiet as the spectators settled down to enjoy the combat. To their delight, the swordsman began clowning. He waved me to come towards him, and then danced away, taunting me as he did so. I knew that he wanted to panic me into casting my net at him while he was in retreat, knowing that once I'd made my throw, I would be no match for his sword and shield. Although the whole Colosseum sounded with laughter at me being made to look so foolish by my adversary's antics, I did not fall into the trap of making a false throw and losing my net. When I managed to get close enough, I swung it in a low circle but kept a tight hold of one end. Thanks to the lead weights, it flew out, and I would have wrapped it round my enemy's legs if he had not made a great leap into the air. The net swept harmlessly beneath him, and there was a roar of approval at his agility, and another as he caught the net on his sword point and jerked it out of my hand. Throwing it behind him, he advanced with his weapon held ready to lunge at my body, and stalked in a wide arc around me. Gripping my trident desperately, I had to keep backing away, and the sweat of fear felt as cold as ice water as it trickled down my hot skin. The swordsman played a cat-and-mouse game, forcing me to retreat just as he wanted. I dared not look behind me, but kept my eyes on his face, which was partly shaded by his helmet, watching for some flick of the eye or sudden twist of the mouth which would warn me that he was about to pounce. So I kept going backwards, until my feet got entangled in my own net lying on the sand just as he had intended, and I fell backwards. My trident flew from my hand. Cheers died away to echoes as the gladiator loomed above me, his sword, which flashed light like a mirror, aimed straight at my throat. Once again, I was defeated. And then something happened that sent new and angry strength surging through me. He winked. It made me determined to free myself from this bully, and as his sword point came nearer, I used one of the oldest tricks in the gladiatorial games. I flung a handful of sand in his face. He drove the sword blindly at me, but I had already rolled to one side, and now it was my turn to dance. While he tugged the blade out of the sand and knuckled his eyes, I seized the net and ran up behind him. A second later, I had cast it over him, drawn it tight, and tripped him up. Noise rolled about me like the thunder of breakers as I snatched up my trident and held it above my trussed tormentor, and then looked towards the Emperor's box for the signal. The surf-like roar faded. Everyone was waiting for the Emperor. Slowly, he raised his hand, and with a great sigh, the audience saw that the imperial thumb was turned down. I did what every gladiator had been trained to do on seeing that sign. I raised the trident. It was the sound of screaming which woke me from my dream, or whatever it was. There was no Egyptian sand on the floor of the arena. In fact, The floor was no longer there, only ancient cellar walls. So why did the shouting continue in my ears? Then I saw Pamela Holt run past me towards Mr. Candy, with blood on her hands and T-shirt. "Help! Something dreadful's happened," she was shouting. "Morris slipped. He's caught on the railings!"